We're still in the 1930s when we have a number of anthropologists who were participating in what was called or is called now scientific racism and eugenics. But there were a number of other early and hopefully more influential anthropologists who were challenging the idea of scientific racism. One of the most famous and one of the people who most of us in anthropology trace our own ancestry to is a person known as the father of U.S. anthropology, Franz Boas. And Boas actually didn't, he himself was an interesting person because he was a Jewish immigrant from Germany at the time. And he actually started measuring people's heads in Ellis Island of people from Italy and Eastern Europe, and then comparing what those people would be like over time with how they lived in basically in New York City. And what he determined is that even if this immigrant population were only marrying with each other and having kids with each other, so they weren't necessarily mixing up yet with other people, that their head form, body shape, all kinds of physical attributes varied or changed based on their new environment. And so we know this is developmental plasticity, that if you eat certain food, you grow up in a certain place, even though your genetics might be the same, you will come out looking very different. And so he's discovered that in one generation, you could have a change in your head form shape, even if you had no genetic change, even if you were only intermarrying with people of your own group. And so this was a radical idea at the time, and people still hate him for it because it challenged the idea that races were somehow fixed categories, that people were physically and mentally grouped in a way that was stable and passed down over time. Eventually, we would develop the idea in anthropology that what we say race is a social construction. It's a belief or a construction about the world. And so, again, this is not to say that people are not biologically varied. We are. We come in different skin tones, heights, shapes, malaria resistance, lactose tolerance. But the way that we group people or have been taught to group people is a product of our belief system. It doesn't say that much about a person's actual biology. The thing of the matter is, though, this runs into a tricky place when, let's say, you're a forensic anthropologist and you're measuring bones and stuff, and a law enforcement officer wants to find out who was the victim of a crime or something, and you're asked, hey, what race was this person? And on television, sometimes we see these people come out and they hold up a bone and they're like, white person. And we're like, well, how did they know that? And I want to talk about this a little bit because it is confusing to us because we can do what is called race estimation, but I want to talk about how that occurs. And I'm going to use the title of an article and some research that was done by a forensic anthropologist, which is called If Races Don't Exist, Why Are Forensic Anthropologists So Good at Identifying Them? And that's a question that people might have. It's, well, wait a second, how can you say that race is socially constructed if you're going to then be talking to me about what these bones were? How did you get that information? So what forensic anthropologists do when they're measuring bones is they measure, in the absence of anything else, if you only have the bones, you're measuring what you think the ancestry of that person was, the geographical ancestry. And so there was an interesting study that was done which proved how much the analysis of bones is going to depend on the context in which they were found. So these forensic anthropologists took these bones that were actually found in a creek in the state of Iowa. Anybody ever been to Iowa? No Iowans here. What do you think of when you think of Iowa? First thing that comes to mind. Yeah, well, if Idaho comes to mind, that's the state that's further west and gives you potatoes. Yes, Idaho is the potatoes. Iowa is corn. Thank you. Yes, corn. Yes, and it's where the presidential debates always happen. The first primary in the nation is, or the first caucuses are always in Iowa, and they're always going out there and posing with corn farmers and stuff like that. It's predominantly a white state, let's just say that. So they found these bones in a creek in Iowa, and they said, well, let's look at these bones in the context of a world database. Where would we think these bones, if we measured them, where would they come from? And they said, well, if we looked at a world database, these bones most match the bones of an Easter Islander. If you've never been to Iowa, you've probably never been to Easter Island. What does Easter Island give us? Yes. What's Easter Island most famous for? It's not corn and it's not potatoes. It's those heads, those big stone heads. Yes. It's very difficult to get to, and there are not that many people on Easter Island. What are the probabilities that this person in Iowa was actually had ancestry in Easter Island? Almost none. So actually, it was an interesting finding based on a world database. But that's not the way it works. You take the percentage of people who live in Iowa, and then you remeasure the bones, or you put those measurements against the probabilities that somebody is going to have such and such an ancestry. And they're like, no, if these bones were found in Iowa, there's a 93% chance that this person would be white based on their bones. But then they did an interesting little move. They said, well, what if these bones had been found in Gary, Indiana? Well, I'm talking about a lot of places you've probably never been to. Anybody ever been to Gary, Indiana? Driven through it? It is perhaps one of the most predominantly black cities in Indiana. And so they said, if these bones had been found in Gary, Indiana, we would say that these bones were probably a black person. That would make sense in that context. And if we had found these bones in Hawaii, we would classify this person as a native Pacific Islander, which makes sense because the original world database, this person matched up to a Easter Islander. So if we had found the same bones in Hawaii. Now, I want to be clear here. When a forensic anthropologist is saying this person is probably this or probably that, it's not because you can tell skin color from bones. It's not because you can tell ethnic markers from bones. It's not because you can tell eye shape from bones. They don't give us any of that. They give us a probability estimate based on certain aspects about where that person geographically had ancestry in. And then we use that to map on to today's racial categories and say somebody that we think was from this region of the world would have probably been considered white or black or Asian. And again, the bones don't really tell us that. And sometimes when we see this on TV, or if it even happens over there in the Jaeger laboratory, you're short-circuiting this process in which you're making a probability estimate based on what's going on with the bones. So we can still say that biologically speaking, race is a social construction. It doesn't mean that people aren't varied, but the place we've classified them is socially constructed. But race is not biological, but it becomes biology through racism. Yeah, as your textbook put it, when you experience the effects of racism, it does affect the effects. Oh, there we go. There's a good differentiation between effect and effect. Experiencing the effects, a noun spelled with an E, of racism directly affects a verb spelled with an A, biology. Little grammar lesson for you there. Experiencing the effects of racism directly affects biology. So that is to say that even though race may not be biologically real, there are biological effects to racism. such as in the hospital. How might this work? Yeah, so this is known as obstetric racism. There's a huge differential in this country in health outcomes for maternal health for Black women as compared to white women. Now, this is not all the same everywhere across the country. There are certain places where this is actually quite reduced or minimized. So it's not based on somebody's genetics. This is not something that has to happen. It's something that is socially produced by the experience. Our textbook also discusses about how experiencing racism can lead to, as Jaw put it, embedded or embodied stress. And so experiencing these things over someone's lifetime, starting from an early age, can have a health impact leading to higher rates of hypertension and basically accelerated aging. And so this is a biological effect of living in a society in which there are differentials for how race is experienced. So one of the things that our textbook talks about is, although that many people are trying to be more attentive to these issues, we have what they call a persistence of racialized societies. So we know that race is a belief about the world, and that racism then is an ideology, which means it is a set of beliefs and practices that are attached to a certain group of people. And so when we talk about racialization, what that means is that we are categorizing people into our typology, the idea that people come in different categories, and then that you institutionalize those advantages for certain people so that the system is perpetuated. And when those advantages are institutionalized, then to get the benefits of the system, you don't need to be individually racist. I don't need to be individually racist in order to benefit from the system in which I move in. When I go into the hospital, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get the best quality care available. And if it's not the best quality care, it's not because of my race. I don't even have to be conscious of that. I can move through society just assuming that I'm going to get the best. I have those advantages. And so those advantages are institutionalized in our society. Interestingly, and I want to introduce this idea to you because your textbook talks about it, and we don't always talk about it when we talk about race and racism, is that racialization in our country and in other places often occurs through what people call colorism, which is basically the idea that you value people who have attributes that are closer to whiteness. And this actually, around the world, and sometimes in our own country, people pay a lot of money to get products to lighten their skin and lighten their hair. This is actually an advertisement from the Philippines, which is meant to speak out against some of these products because some of them can be quite dangerous for your health. But they're trying to illustrate this tendency. And so, again, colorism occurs in many societies, not just in the United States. And it also can occur within groups that are marginalized. So, for those of you who are maybe more familiar with living in Black or Latino communities, there often is within these communities a preference for those who seem to be closer to, who have attributes which are closer to lighter skin. And people in a lot of white people, actually, we also do this too, although we don't always realize it. I'll use the Family Guy card to illustrate, which you probably have seen before. In our society, we generally believe that we have this line between the light-skinned and the people of color, as we say, and the people that are above the line are okay, and those that are not okay or below the line. But there's actually also, if you put, for example, the psychologists have done studies where they'll take two photographs of two different people, one who would be African American but light skinned, and one who would be African American but darker skinned. And they'll say, okay, well, this person committed such and such a crime. And the juror or the jurist will actually believe or impose a harsher sentence on the darker skin than the lighter skinned person. And so this actually does happen in our own society where there are sort of gradients of the okay and the not okay, although we don't always realize it because we have these perhaps more rigid lines in our own society. So at the end of the textbook, they talk about how we learn to racialize people into categories. One of those ways is by various forms of census taking and filling out forms and putting people into boxes. The census is a place where everyone who lives in the United States during a certain year has to say what they are. They have to answer the race question. There are all sorts of other questions we could ask about people, like their income or their education. We don't ask, but we make them answer this question about race. Now, I want to be careful here. I don't necessarily say that we should stop asking people about this, because if you don't have that information, oftentimes these categories or the inequalities can continue without being addressed, but it's one way that we learn how to racialize people. Another way is in how we train and police people. How does that happen? Yeah, we're not trying to condemn any and all police officers, but oftentimes people are trained to carry out the ideas that are prevalent in our society. You mentioned the idea that, oh, we're going into the jungle there. So this idea that people who live in a certain area are automatically going to be associated with the traits of the jungle. Of course, this also happens in our school system. Our schools are extremely segregated by race. They're not legally, you're not supposed to be, but they still are, and often it's because of geographical area. We talked about how people live in neighborhoods where they can buy houses, and that's going to mean a certain wealth type lives in a certain neighborhood, and then your schools are based on property taxes, and so some schools are going to have more resources than others. So that's where we get. And of course, everyday interactions with people and how we are trained to deal with people and relate to them and talk about them. Carrie used a big word, which your textbook also uses, is how these institutions reinforce something called white supremacy, which your textbook says is a political, economic, and cultural system into which those who are identified as white overwhelmingly control power and material resources. And you can look at statistically. Again, that is not to say that there are no people who have wealth that are not white people, but if you look at the people who own most of the resources and control most of the power, that's what you get. And then that there are added onto that, the conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority are widespread. Probably. Racism is daily reenacted, and systematic oppression of non-white people is justified. I'll leave it up to you to decide to what extent our society matches this description. I was happy to see, actually, most anthropology textbooks that I have taught, we talked about racism, we talk about race, we talk about structural racism, but they would not have used this word white supremacy. That was something that would probably have been seen as a bridge too far for most anthropology textbooks. And so I was happy to see that in 2024, because when this textbook came out, they started using this term and started talking about it within anthropology. It's rather incredible that they were able to do this, because a lot of people want to deny or minimize this. If we recognize these things in our own society, it can be helpful for people to navigate that. And it might be helpful to understand this in order to change it. It doesn't have to be this way. these days, it's probably half illegal to even call our society of white supremacy. These words and concepts and ideas are being taken out of our educational system. So I'm enjoying it while I still can teach it. Might be the last time, but think about it. Does this term, do these ideas characterize our own society? And if so, how could we be different from what we are?